Okay, don't click my pen.
The following is a local resident producers program. The program content is the sole responsibility of the producer and does not necessarily reflect the views or policies of CATV2, Oshkosh Community Access Television, the City of Oshkosh, the Oshkosh Cable Television Advisory Commission, or Time Warner Cable.
Hi, and welcome to Eye on Oshkosh. I'm Cheryl Hentz, along with former Oshkosh Mayor and Councilwoman Melanie Bloechl. For a number of years now, the City of Oshkosh Common Council has been asked to ban smoking in restaurants. And recently, Councilman Mark Harris has said that he intends to bring forth such an ordinance. And Mr. Harris is here with us on this edition, and he's going to talk about the ordinance that he's proposing, why he's decided to bring it forth, and then we'll talk about some other issues going on within the city. Thanks very much for being here, Mark.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Especially on a holiday weekend. We appreciate
Yes,
your
very
coming
much.
in. As I mentioned in the open, Dan Lynch, one of our citizens in the city, has been, I think, probably the strongest proponent for this kind of an ordinance. What exactly has prompted you to bring forth a non-smoking ordinance in our restaurants?
Well, there is a group in the city, Breathe Free Oshkosh, and for several years now they've been coming to me and asking me if I would support such an ordinance. And because secondhand smoke is actually the third largest preventable cause of death, it made sense to at least bring something forward and let it be debated.
Okay. Now, I think if the paper can be quoted accurately, what you're looking at doing is making it a ban in all restaurants, but bars would be exempted? Or is it restaurants with bars? Or what exactly do you envision for this?
It's similar to what's been done already in Fond du Lac and up in Neenah, that there would be a test based on the percentage of your revenue that comes from alcohol and the percentage that comes from food. And those establishments that generate more revenue from alcohol than from food would be exempted. And those would be primarily the bars and the taverns. However, if you're primarily a restaurant, if the bulk of your income comes from the sale of food, then smoking would be banned in your dining rooms. And unless your bar area was in a separate airspace, separately ventilated, isolated from the rest of the area, not just by an open corridor or open space, but by, air controls of some kind, maybe double doors or something that would isolate that air, then that would have to be non-smoking as well. Now, if someone had a separate room that was a completely separate airspace, separated from the other ones by double doors, separated by ventilation, not sharing the same heating system, then they could consider it two businesses, one that would be over 50% food, that would be a restaurant, and smoking would be banned there. But in the separate space, they could treat it like a bar or tavern, and it would be exempt. And actually, I think they would, if you didn't have that exception, people would go about breaking their businesses into pieces and would accomplish the same thing. So you might as well have that exemption in there.
That sounds a little bit different than what Neenah has. I haven't seen their full ordinance, but I think that goes a little bit further than what theirs does. I don't think that theirs talks specifically about separate enclosures and that kind of thing, but they do have the exemptions if you're such a percentage of your business comes from alcohol, that kind of thing. What about the bars just being exempted in and of themselves? I guess the question that comes to my mind is, are the health and safety of bar patrons and bar employees, is that more important in your mind than the health and safety of restaurant employees and patrons?
I think that distinction between the bars and the restaurant is probably based more on what I think can be accomplished at this time with the city council. But there is some subtle differences. The restaurants tend to have a lot of young help, whereas generally employees in a strictly bar setting are usually people that are old enough to serve. So the people starting out working in a tavern or bar generally are a little bit older than many of the employees in the restaurants. And part of the problem is it's the lifelong exposure to secondhand smoke that poses the greatest danger.
Okay.
So you can make a distinction between those two, but I think it's just a political reality that the community's not ready for a broad smoking ban. I certainly would like all the employees in Oshkosh to be able to work in a smoke-free environment, but I don't think it's realistic to think that we could do that, and I don't expect that would happen anytime in the near future either. I think a ban in the restaurants would probably satisfy the community right now.
Okay.
Why do you feel as though, I mean, I know that you have an association with this Breathe, I can't even say it.
Breathe Free Oshkosh.
Thank you. But there are restaurants presently that have made choices to go smoke-free.
Yes.
Why wouldn't we just leave it up to the restaurant owners? I mean, while cigarette smoke, secondhand cigarette smoke, and I've been a smoker and a non-smoker, both, and I certainly would not suggest starting up smoking to anyone. But why not let the owners make their own decisions? Some of them already have gone smoke-free based on their own businesses, their own trends, their own location, the ventilation systems, and so forth. Why legislate this?
You could do it that way. You could say, let's just let the restaurant owners choose, and then the patrons will go to those restaurants
Right.
that either allow smoking or don't allow smoking according to their desires. But I think if you look at cigarettes objectively, to say, what is a cigarette really like? Because we treat it different than it really is because they've been around so long. A cigarette is really a delivery system for both an addictive drugs and a concoction of toxins. And it's such an inefficient delivery system that it doesn't just deliver it to the person who chooses to smoke, but everybody that shares the same airspace as them.
But I mean, those same kind of calls could be made about alcohol. Alcohol is a delivery system for a habitual drug for some people. They can't, and quite frankly, depending on your tolerance level, your size, your consumption, the time of day, what your metabolism is, you can have 3 or 4 drinks. You might be able to have them and walk out and it's not a problem depending on how you've timed it. The guy sitting next to you at the bar that's perfectly legal, sitting and having the same 3 drinks, can step out the door and smuck 2 or 3 teenagers.
Well, I think you make a valid point, but a distinction between the two is that if someone chooses to drink an alcoholic beverage, they're not exposing the other people near them to the alcohol in the same fashion that a cigarette smoker is exposing the other patrons of the restaurant to the nicotine and the benzene and the ammonia and all the other elements. And there's about 30 elements in the typical cigarette now, and we don't always even know what's in them because when they put the warnings on the packages, they got an exemption. They no longer have to disclose the contents of them, and they no longer have to pass any sort of food and drug safety rules. But there's elements within these cigarettes that if even trace amounts of them were found in a restaurant, in their food, or from any other source other than cigarettes, it wouldn't be allowed. And, I'll give you an example. No one's going to die from a few rodent hairs, but we inspect restaurants for cleanliness and for issues like that, and you could shut them down for issues where they're not really going to kill anybody. But here we have something that is believed to kill about 78,000 Americans a year, about 3,000 because of lung cancer, and about 60,000 because of heart failure, and then others from other related diseases.
But yet it's still a perfectly legal substance.
Absolutely. Although cigarettes are legal because of the political arena. Basically an enormous amount of money has been invested to keep cigarettes legal. But if they were regulated like any other food or drug, any other consumable product for consumers, they couldn't pass any of the tests today. It's the only product that if it's even when used as intended, that it will kill 1/3 of its consumers.
One of the things I noticed that you said on the onset is that this is the third leading killer, secondhand smoke. Do you know what 1 and 2 are?
Well, the third preventable
Preventable.
killer.
But do you know what 1 and 2 are?
I haven't got a clue.
Well, it's very interesting.
I bet Mel does.
One of the leading preventable causes of death is type 2 diabetes, and that is from morbid obesity.
Okay.
Which I find very interesting because, and you, some of the people that will be in this group that will support the no smoking ban will say, but, you know, obesity really doesn't affect other people's lives. You know, by being overweight, I'm not rubbing my overweight off onto the next person or causing, you know, undue damage. But there is damage because with healthcare costs skyrocketing, 5 to 10% of the population uses health care while the rest of us are paying for it.
Well, and that's the same with the cigarettes.
But you don't legislate somebody not being able to go to McDonald's and stuff a Big Mac down their gullet to prevent morbid obesity, which is killing our children and all kinds of people. Heart disease, type 2 diabetes. I mean, there's a plethora of health concerns from eating too much cheese, too much milk. We do it all the time. I mean, we live in Wisconsin. How do we legislate things that are bad for us, even though it does cost us? I mean, healthcare costs being what they are, morbid obesity is costing this country an awful lot of money. Would you and these same people then legislate getting rid of red meat, cheese, milk byproducts that clog arteries, cause cholesterol, high blood pressure, heart disease, liver, kidney? I mean, these are some significant damages that can be done because people are in excess.
Well, I think if you want a politician to go against cheese, you'll have to look elsewhere because you know, really, as a politician, we hate these issues because on an issue like the smoke-free issues, you do make some enemies because there are people that feel strongly about the issue on both sides. And surprisingly, there's smokers and non-smokers on both sides of this issue that have strong feelings. So it is an issue when you know going into it, you're going to make enemies that will remember much longer than the friends you make over the issue. But I think it's really a public health issue, and I think it's one that should be debated, and one that we really should ban the smoking from the dining rooms. There's other issues that are important to me. I have 3 children and a foster child, and you know, people wouldn't dream of using another addictive drug in front of your kids, but they're very casually light up a cigarette. And I think really, you know, kids learn everything else by example. You can sit them down in front of Sesame Street, and 6 months later they're saying their numbers in their alphabet. What do you think happens when they repeatedly see people openly smoking? I think it probably sends a signal that this is something that's not too bad.
Well, it's probably similar to people cracking open a beer in front of their kids on the weekend. I mean, how many people casually open up a beer or mix a cocktail or a Bloody Mary and think nothing of it? And alcohol is every bit as addictive and can kill and can cause addictions and can cause, I guess, one of the things that I thought was very interesting, you of all the people on the council, I would have never thought would have brought this ordinance forth. And I'll tell you why. You have always professed to be a very Democrat.
Yes.
And Democrats are historically, or have historically been, about choice, about freedoms, about more, you know, letting business do what they need to do in order to prosper, keeping government out of things, you know, freedoms of choice. Do you still have those basic beliefs, and well, that doesn't conflict with what you're trying to do here?
Well, I don't think I'm really trying to stop people from being able to smoke. I'm trying to stop them from being able to smoke in an environment where they're exposing other people that don't want to smoke.
But again, that's about choice, because if you let the owners decide that their establishments will or will not be smoking, the people have a choice. It's just like watching violence or obscenities or profanities on TV. Mom and Dad have a choice. You can sit there and pretend that this is all perfectly okay, or click, you change the channel.
But we can express the same thing in a different way. When you go to so many restaurants today and they ask you if you want to be in the smoking or the non-smoking section, and they're different ends of the same room, the non-smoker's really not getting a choice. They're going to be breathing in smoke.
What about just
regardless of where they
changing
sit.
ventilation systems? I mean,
That was my
Yeah.
one of the questions that I had. You know, there are some restaurants in this community that you walk in and the smoke just hits you like a ton of bricks. And I think we all know the couple restaurants that I'm probably talking
Sure.
about. Excellent food, terrific service, but the smoke is enough to choke a horse. And it's terrible. And you cannot enter the building without being exposed to it. Now, I don't care for smelling that either, and yet I still like the food, I'll go there. So what about if you would just make restaurants have a choice here, give them a choice. Say either you put in these super fantabulous ventilation systems that just suck this smoke right out of the air, and it's possible because there are also some restaurants in this community, Mark, that have great ventilation systems. You can't smell the smoke at all. I know it would be an expense, but what about the expense of them losing the business because people can't smoke and they're going to go
Well,
elsewhere? So,
but
you
you
know,
know,
they
we're-
can weigh that.
Sure.
So why not give them the opportunity to say, okay, give them a choice. You either put the ventilation system in and make it a good one, or you have to ban smoking in your establishment.
Well, you know what? Actually, we would be the 13th community in Wisconsin to adopt this type of ban. And the experience in the other 12 is that it's not a significant loss of business. In fact, in most communities that have gone smoke-free, the number of patrons coming into the restaurants who are avoiding them because of a sensitivity to smoke exceeds the number of smokers choosing not to go out to eat anymore because they want to have a cigarette at the same time as their meal. So generally, it hasn't hurt business, and in fact, those businesses in Oshkosh that have already switched to be smoke-free have generally gotten an economic benefit from that, because there are some costs, like you say, additional ventilation. You know, maybe you have to have things cleaned more often if you're a smoking establishment, but also the fact that if people aren't smoking at the tables turn over faster. So a restaurant that has a very busy weekend business,
Like on a
will able-
Friday night fish fry.
Sure. They'll actually be able to fit in more diners and sell more food if they're non-smoking. And in fact, so far what I've heard from the restaurants is a concern that this is a rough time in the economy, and so they are worried about the loss of business. But again, that's not been the experience elsewhere in Wisconsin, nor has it been the experience nationally. Even those places that have had a total ban haven't had the loss of business that everybody thought.
But would you at least be open to an either-or situation rather than making it no smoking, that's it?
Well, here's the real problem, is that what the restaurants are concerned about, I think they realize that there probably isn't going to be a loss of the overall number of diners. The real fear is that there'll be some sort of shift in where they dine. So for instance, if your business caters to a heavy smoking crowd, there's some fear that if you're primarily a restaurant, that you'll lose your customers or some of your customers to someone that's a tavern, where they can continue to smoke. So it isn't that the total amount of restaurant business will decline. The facts just don't support that where it's been tried before. The fear is more of one that the business may shift around between taverns and restaurants and one type of restaurant and another. Maybe a restaurant that actually has a separate room or separate facility with a bar in it may actually find this to be a bit of a boom because they can accommodate everybody. Whereas another place that has maybe a small bar right in the center of a dining room which they can't easily isolate will have more of a problem. I do think that I'm willing to consider that we may have to make some compromises, maybe consider some amendments that would help shield an establishment from a loss of business, or that would help mitigate the shifting of consumers from one place to another, because I really don't want anyone to lose a job over this. But at the same time, I think it's enough of a public health issue that I think it's the right direction to go. And I have to tell you that the response I'm receiving from people, most of it just in-person comments, is overwhelmingly positive. And I think you'd be amazed at how many people don't frequent restaurants because of the smoke.
What kind of comments are you getting from other council members? Do you feel as though you probably have the kind of support that you need in order to get this passed through the council?
You know, we're hampered by the open meetings laws, so I
Mhm.
can't really poll the rest of the council. I can
Right.
only guess on where they might stand from
They haven't
past
asked you any
comments.
specific questions or made any comments to you?
Well, you know, it's still a work in process at this point.
Okay.
Um,
When is this going to come forth, Mark?
I think the first reading should probably be the end of this month, and the second reading sometime in July.
Wow.
I think it makes sense to bring it forward, but whether it would be read twice, lost my mic here, whether it be read twice.
Why
and-
don't you
and
get that on,
pass.
Mark, and then say your comment, so we don't miss it. We
Yeah.
don't want
Okay.
to miss what you have to say.
What we were saying is that probably the first reading, the end of July, the second reading sometime in August. And then I suspect there may be, even if it were to pass after 2 readings, there may be some amount of time before it would be implemented. Or in the process of having a discussion on this, there might be other council members that are willing to go along but want amendments to it. We may get more information from the restaurants and taverns that will help us fine tune this. But I really would like to see something in place by the first of the year, certainly.
What kind of forfeitures will be in place if, let's say you pass this, the council's supportive, it goes in its totality, and the restaurant owners say, you know what, Mr. Harris, I am just not doing it. I'm running a legal operation, I don't have the money to do what you want me to do. You're
And it's a
gonna kill-"
legal product?
Yeah, it's a legal product. I don't have the money to do what you want me to do, and you're going to put me out of business. What kind of forfeitures are in place?
There probably would have to be some sort of fine that would discourage the defiance, but that's not been the experience where it's been tried. Generally, the restaurant owners go along with it once it's passed. And again, their primary fear is that there'll be a loss of business. If in fact they can go smoke-free and not have a loss of business, actually most of them prefer it on a personal level. Oftentimes restaurants are family-run businesses, and many of them that have been in the business for a long time have had family members that had suffered illnesses from secondhand smoke. We had a gentleman at the council meeting the other night that talked about the fact that he went smoke-free. He's representing the restaurants as a group and has concerns about how they'll hold up in this economy with the change. But even in his discussion, he mentioned that he had 2 longtime waitresses that were too valuable to lose, but both had developed emphysema. So he had no choice but to go smokeless in his dining room or lose these valued employees.
Well, again, I find it interesting that the council and you are considering instituting an ordinance like this or even having this discussion. And part of the premise that you talk about is employees and innocents having repercussions from secondhand
Sure.
smoke. But you've been lenient on contractors in this community who have complained that our inspection department is too tough on them.
No, I don't think I've been lenient on the contractors. In fact, even in the city manager's goals, you know, once again, there came up this issue of complaints that the inspections department is difficult to work with. But the complaints are never that they're enforcing the code too tightly. I mean, they have no choice. They need to enforce the code. There's been complaints more about attitude or helpfulness. It's like they're not cooperating with us when we want to meet the code. They're not telling us what we have to do to accomplish that. That's the type of complaint we're getting.
But the contractors know that legally that can't be done.
Well, what they're telling us is, you know, many of them work in a variety of communities, and they're telling us that they've had more difficulty in this community. So I think it's more a problem of perceived attitude. And I'll concede that you could overcome a long-term attitude problem, and it's going to take a long time to win people over and convince them that you've resolved that problem. But that's what that's about. That's not really about code enforcement, because that has a safety implication to it
Very
as well.
much so. I mean, if we don't have, and that was kind of my segue, is that if we are looking at legislating restaurants to keep secondhand smoke from affecting the populace, why would we not have an equally strong enforcement division who's going to have to go into these restaurants and enforce this and work with contractors who are going to be doing these kinds of things? And the contractors are already complaining and whining that the laws are too tough and we do too much, and, you know, our inspectors are harping on them all the time. So, you know, and that really has an impact on safety issues, fire inspection, you know, safety, meeting all the codes that need to be met from building to fire to, you know, you name it, it has to be done. And we already have problems. Now you're going to add the smoke-free environment into the restaurants and send these inspectors in there to do another dirty job and be incredibly unpopular. One of the things that I wanted to know is, in talking about the inspectors and the builders, we put cameras in the inspection department, and I know we don't call it the inspection department anymore. I think it's, what is it called?
Oh, I don't even,
It's,
wasn't
well,
aware
it
they
used to be,
changed the name.
it was going to be, it was the inspection department or enforcement division, and now it's community, I don't know, services or some such thing, because we're busy
It sounds friendlier.
well, and it, you know, what they're doing is enforcing state and city codes. So what my question is that with the cameras being in place, and there was a significant number of dollars that were spent for that purpose, what, anything good, bad, anything relevant that has come out of that?
Well, you know, the decision to put in the cameras was not one that was made by the council.
Correct, but
That was made by city administration, and we've not been privileged to see transcripts or view segments of the tapes. So that's being used internally by the city manager and management in City Hall. And I'm presuming that they're getting their own benefit from that. It may be that in part it helps defend the employees if someone's alleging that they weren't treated fairly, and maybe the film would show it a little bit different, put a different perspective on it. But it also would probably help management determine if there is a public relations problem going on and take some action to make it better.
Are you not interested in seeing or hearing what relevant information might be coming out of that? Because I know during executive sessions where we have talked about these issues, even during Mr. Wollink's reviews where some of this stuff came up, there were several council members. Mr. Dell'Antonia was very outspoken about the inspection department and not feeling as though our inspectors did a good enough job. Are we not interested in hearing what
I have to inject that the complaint has never been that they don't know the code or that they're not enforcing the code.
They're just not nice enough when they're doing it.
Yeah, I think that's
Well, I mean, that's the
really
crux of
problem.
it. They're saying that we're not holding enough hands and, you know, walking these guys down the lily white path, which unfortunately some of these people have been building in this community a lot longer than our inspectors have been born, I think. But it wouldn't, I mean, going to all the trouble and really bringing the inspection department to the forefront where all of these meetings have been held with administration, and Mr. Dell'Antonia, Mr. Hentz, and I believe even yourself was in one of those meetings, were you not?
not
with the
with
builders?
the inspectors or the.
With contractors though, correct? You were in meetings with contractors who complained?
I was invited to have a meeting with a group of contractors that were complaining, but there was no meetings where they were there with city staff.
But just meeting with
management.
different contractors who
Sure,
were using your ear to kind of...
As well as people that have done their own projects.
Sure. But
just heard
wouldn't
from a
you-
variety of people.
Knowing what the complaints were, knowing what has been put in place, knowing what the administration and this kind of ongoing battle is, you don't want to know kind of what's going on now that we've spent the money and...
You know, as you well know, we're part-time city council people. We have full-time jobs that
Yeah.
we make a real living at.
Thank God.
Yeah, I think you've got to leave that to the city management, you know, to the city manager and the department heads, for them to regulate that kind of detail. We can set the policy, and I think with the inspections area, what we're saying is that we're hearing too many complaints from too many people that they're being dealt with as if they were an enemy rather than someone that wants to comply with the rules, but just needs to know what the problem is so they can address it. So we can send that message back to city management that the community is unhappy about the level of conflict coming from this department. But as far as getting involved in the details of how they cure that, and
Has it been cured, though? I guess that's the real question here is, we've done all these things, there's been all this conversation, all these complaints. You know, the onus of the responsibility has kind of been thrust that the inspection department is really the problem. has the problem been solved? Have we identified that the inspection department really isn't friendly, or have we found out that contractors are having difficulty following the rules? And we don't know that.
Yeah, I'm still hearing some new stories, but I believe that some progress has been made. It's really hard to measure because each time someone feels they've been treated badly, it kind of reactivates this long list of grievances from the
Sure.
past. So once they have a reputation of being difficult to work with, they're really going to have to be still diligent about the code, but very positive in their attitude, very helpful in the way they approach this
Yes,
for
you
a long
will tear
time.
out those trusses and replace them properly and smile. It's a darn good thing we don't have cameras on police cars. Can you imagine how unhappy people would be when they got their tickets?
But think about, you know, I haven't been stopped by police people very often, but they're very, very respectful when they do stop you. Sir, are you aware that you were going 7 miles an hour over the limit? Is there any special reason for this? They treat you like you're really important as they're telling you that we're going to give you a ticket because you've gone a little too fast.
Could you tell me where you've been picked up? Because that's certainly not been my experience. Of course, not that I've been picked up often either.
I want to go back for just a second to the smoking ordinance, and then we'll talk about stormwater utility
Okay.
and stuff like that. A double-edged question for you, Mark.
Okay.
We've got the state threatening to pull back some of the money, you know, $2 million, or a couple, how many?
Million.
How much is it?
About $1 million in shared revenue. Maybe
About $1 million,
more, maybe
possibly
less.
more.
Yeah.
So with that threat hanging over our heads, and that will spin off into probably some job losses,
Good.
or at least hours being cut, you know, maybe full-time people going to part-time. Now we're talking about bringing forth another layer of legislation that someone's going to have to enforce it. It's not, we can't just let people police themselves necessarily. I mean, that would be great, but we live in the real world, that doesn't happen. So how do you balance that? I mean, I'm not at all suggesting that you forego safety and welfare of citizens because we don't have money to enforce things, but how do you as a councilman see this kind of fleshing out, that we'll be able to enforce this, pay people to enforce it when we're facing, you know, $1 million or more in cuts from the state?
Well, you know, if this passes, the residents of the city will be aware that it passed, and the patrons of the restaurants themselves are likely to complain if in fact smoking's allowed to continue in a place where it's required to be stopped. So I don't think there'll be any difficulty finding out who's complying with the rules and who's not. And in fact, I think the industry itself, if this passes, I think most of them will try to comply in good faith, and they're very likely to let us know if they feel one of their competitors is getting an unfair advantage by breaking the rules. So I really don't anticipate that it'll be any significant additional enforcement costs. Plus, remember, we're already going into these establishments to make sure that they're not serving minors, that they're
Minors.
complying with all the different rules for operating the bars, as well as the health inspections for the restaurants. So I just don't think there'll be any significant increase in cost there.
Okay.
But actually, when you do the inspections for serving minors, that's our PD, that's our Oshkosh Police Department. Food inspection is done by our health department.
That's right.
And then any code violation would be our inspectors. So you actually have potentially 3 different entities, not including the state coming in.
Or would this be the health department, because since this is a health issue,
I don't know.
is this something that you would think would be enforced by the health department?
My guess is that, I mean, to the extent that there'd be a penalty phase, it would probably be a police citation.
Okay.
Okay.
That would be my expectation. But there is enough different layers of government in there that if a restaurant is just going to defy it and tell everybody go ahead and smoke,
I doubt that will
we'll
happen.
know.
but-
I do too.
Yeah, I doubt that will happen, but being the rebel that I am, I had to throw that out there because, you know, there may be one of us left.
Switching gears, did you have anything
I
else
just had
on
one
smoking?
follow-up question, not actually on smoking, but back to the inspection department. Because it actually was a segue from health issues to inspection to, one of the things that I had questioned is, there is a practice that's presently being done within the inspection department that I'm not sure you're aware of, but certainly will be aware of come budget time. The inspection department assesses what's called reinspection fees. That's for contractors who have to, our inspectors have to keep going back to site to make sure that they have met code. Well, every time that that happens, there was a relatively hefty reinspection fee because they were not to call our inspection department for an inspection until they were actually ready to sign off and say everything's where it's supposed to be. Those reinspection fees have cease and desist. Those no longer are being assessed to contractors, which the contractors had originally agreed to this reinspection fee because they knew the paperwork and the additional man hours that were required to keep sending people back to, unfortunately, only a handful of contractors. That was a significant revenue source that was generated by those reinspection fees. That, for all intents and purposes, is going to be gone. Is that something that's wise? I mean, that may be a policy that the inspection department or the chief inspector may have devised to try to keep peace at a very tentative time. I don't see that as a very wise move in a budgetary time when every single penny is going to count. We've been very fortunate in the community because Oshkosh Inspection Department more than pays for itself. But those monies were set aside for equipment, possibly more, more inspectors, things like that. I mean,
Well,
do you think that
those
that's
reinspection fees were intended to force the contractor to address the problem before they called someone back out there? Because if you go out there and they're still not in compliance, you've got to go out a third time. So it's adding to the amount of work.
correct?
If that's still occurring, where people aren't addressing the problem, and it's causing additional time to be taken, that wouldn't please me because that has to be paid for somehow. But the other side of that was that if someone was told something didn't comply with code, and they sincerely didn't, looking at the code, they couldn't find what the discrepancy was. And so they tried to interpret what might be the difference, they tried to fix it, and then the inspections came back out and they were thinking of some completely different reason why it didn't comply. That's very frustrating because it's delaying whoever's building or making a home improvement as well. So maybe there's cases where, all right, I guess we didn't give you enough information of what type of change you needed to make. Maybe waiving a fee in that case makes sense. And I think it's worth my investigating what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I think that just simply because, again, this particular department, by virtue of the city growing, has been a very, I hate to use the term lucrative because it sounds like we're trying to make money on people building homes or what have you. But this department has more than paid for itself, and I mean, they do a lot of work that I think the general public's probably not aware of. But I wondered if that was something that the council had agreed to, because the reinspection fees were actually agreed to by the contractor some time ago, because there was so much difficulty in these constant revisits back and forth. And again, it was always just the same handful of people that we seemed to be having problems with. So I was just very interested in seeing during revenue tight times if that's going to be something that's going to become an issue next budget.
Well, if it's a significant amount of revenue and it's the result of them having to do additional work, that's probably something we'd want to think about. But you have to give them some have to give them some discretion.
Sure. And I understand that.
Moving on then to the stormwater utility. Now, twice the stormwater, this has been bandied about for I don't know how many years, 3 at least, probably longer than that. And twice the stormwater utility creation has come before the council for a vote. Twice it's been laid over, and both times you've supported laying it over. What is it that you feel needs to be done to tweak this so that it will pass? What are you looking for?
Well, my primary problem with the way it was done was that the rate that we were going to assess, and of course we were only going to take a half year's worth of stormwater fees, but would have raised over $1 million, when at budget time we had only put in about $415,000 of expenses into the stormwater utility. So the rate they were charging was based on a rate they believe they'll need next year to cover costs they anticipate putting in the stormwater utility. But that is a city council function. And my concern would be that to the extent that we're doing new stormwater projects, it makes sense to me that those should fall in the stormwater utility. It should pick up the cost. And it's just a better way of allocating that cost over the source of the stormwater. But I don't want this to be a way, sort of a backroom tax increase, where you can take items that are already in the tax levy, and without coming before the people and telling them why you're doing it, move those expenses out of the levy into the utility, but not changing the rate or explaining why you're not changing the rate. So let me give you an example. If we took $1 million worth of expenses that are already being taxed for in the budget, and we shifted those to the stormwater utility because we were already collecting enough money to cover them, that would then free up $1 million in the general levy to cover other expenses, but without us ever having to pass the tax increase or explain to the public what we were doing. So what I'm saying is, last budget year, we identified $415,000 worth of expenses that we moved to the stormwater utility. The assessment that we collect this year should cover those items that we've budgeted there. Now, I suspect in the next budget year, the amounts will be much higher, especially if we address, maybe a flood control basin on Sawyer Creek, or the Anchorage Basin where we have some flooding up on Murdoch. That's going to drive up the cost of that utility, but there should be an explanation of what we're doing.
So you're looking more for greater clarity rather than necessarily kind of acquiescing to the business community, because I know they are PO'd about this. I mean, there's no they don't want it. They are going to continue to lambaste this council. And,
Sure.
and what I've heard from a lot of the people in the community, Mark, is that private citizens are afraid that the business community is going to just beat the snot out of you council members until you just throw up your hands and say, okay, fine. And yet we private citizens are going to still continue carrying the water, no pun intended, for the business community and the nonprofits in this community, which is highly unfair if that were to happen. And I would hope that that would not happen.
I think it's pretty clear from the votes that there's disputes over the details of this still, but I think we're getting much closer. But that it seems to me that all 7 council people support the concept of having the stormwater utility, and the dispute is more on the details of it.
Okay.
Another issue that I did care about, although it was not as primary, is holding down the stormwater assessment to the budgeted expenses in there, was that they're basing it on a unit that represents the average runoff from a residential home. And initially, it's going to probably be 1 unit per home. The city really doesn't have the time to use a different method. But I'm also hoping that for next year, that they establish sort of a small, medium, and large. And while the average number of units per home would still come out to 1, because that's what the unit represents, that the smallest 20% of homes would have some assessment that would be less than the average. The average would, of course, have 1 unit per home. And then the 20% of the homes that are the largest would have a higher assessment, so that the total still averaged out to 1. Because obviously, a very large ranch home with a large driveway and a patio is going to cause more stormwater runoff than maybe a very small 2-story home with with an urban narrow driveway, you know.
Well, here's a thought, and I'm thinking about this just because I just got the letter from the city today. My home is being assessed. I've got to call you guys at the city in the next 10 days to make my appointment. What about, make it 1 ERU for each residential home for right now, but then as homes are assessed, I don't know how many years, every number of years this is done, 10 years or whatever the case may be, but how about as each home is assessed, maybe then taking a look at each individual home and making it more even based on the size. Is that possible?
Well, I think we're due for an overall assessment.
Okay.
And that might be, you could do it in conjunction with that, because maybe part of that process is measuring square footage. It's a little different in that they're trying to measure the impervious surface, so they're basically measuring roofs, drives,
Sure, but you can
patios.
get a better handle if you're actually out there looking at the property, I
Sure.
would think.
And that would make sense to do it in conjunction with that. They have told us they're not ready to do that for the assessments that would go out this year. And in fact, we're getting late enough that there's probably only going to be one bill to go out, and there's some dispute as to whether that bill will be for 2 quarters at the regular quarterly rate, or if we'll let the rate be higher this year and just have them have 1 quarter's rate. I think either way, you're probably looking at something like maybe $19 for a home being charged for the stormwater utility. Now, one of the disadvantages,
And that's a year, correct?
Or a
well,
quarter.
that represents the original rates that they were suggesting. That represented a half year. But again, I basically cut it in half because they were going to raise so much more money than what we'd actually budgeted. And I'm probably going to get a little lost in these numbers because I didn't prepare to talk
Sure,
about that
sure.
tonight. But it doesn't necessarily relate to what the 4 quarterly billings will be next year. That amount will be set through our budget process. And it have a lot to do with what stormwater projects
Yeah.
we're going to proceed
Sure.
with, and whether we take items that are already in the existing budget and move those over because they relate to stormwater to the stormwater utility. But I just think it's very important that we do that as part of the budget process, and so that the public knows, okay, we're taking this item out of the general levy and moving it over here, and we're doing that because we're spending that money on this other thing, or because we're cutting the taxes, or because we're raising the taxes less than we otherwise would have to. I don't want it to be a stealth way of covering what the state's doing to us on
Sure.
revenue sharing by just shifting items over to the stormwater utility, but leaving the assessment on the property taxes that was there all along.
Sure.
But we've actually done that before. I mean,
Have we?
you bet. When we pull cemeteries out and we make that a separate
Sure.
entity, I mean, we've done that. We've been very creative with our budget. We pull certain things out so that it doesn't affect our cap.
Although generally when we're doing that, like with the cemetery, it's generally a service that already has a revenue associated with it.
Right.
So you're pulling the expense and the revenue out of the budget.
Right, and then it
Whereas-
doesn't affect where you can only be in your expenditures and your caps, because with expenditure restraints, we get really pounded because we're so fiscally frugal that because we keep our spending down so far, we only have otherwise if you go so far above your spending, you're penalized. So people who've historically been frugal get slapped around at budget time. If you spend like a drunken sailor, which is what we hear an awful lot, you get a lot more money back. One of the things I want to ask you, what I'm concerned about is, number one, and you know I've been very critical of you and your sometimes what I view as your inability to make the tough decisions. I mean, you know that. You and I have had these conversations. Well, surprise! Yeah. I mean, I don't pull too many punches, and you and I have had these conversations, and I view the stormwater management as obviously controversial, simply because of the politics associated with it, with the businesses. It was interesting because I came to that council meeting when you were talking about stormwater management, and I feel very strongly that it needs to be done. It needs to be done in an expeditious fashion. It's really been talked about for a very long time.
Sure.
3 to 4 years just in the works, but many years previous to that, knowing that we were working to this end.
I can remember a candidates forum. And,
Many
And you and I
times.
both mentioned it as
Over
in the
and
top 10
over
things to
and
be done.
over.
Yeah.
And yeah, I know it wasn't glamorous, and I know a lot of people were like, stormwater management, big deal. But what I find interesting is, when I was sitting in those council chambers, John Casper from the Chamber of Commerce was sitting just just behind me and a few seats over. And one of the council members was talking to a citizen about the not-for-profits paying their fair share, and the churches. And the particular resident that was at the dais at the time said, well, so what? We all go to church, who
Sure.
cares? And John Casper mumbled in the back and said, who cares? It's only 4% of the overall bill. Why bill them at all? It's only 4% of the pop.
Does he not get it? It all adds up.
Well, what the difficulty is that while churches may come up with 4% of the actual population as far as churches being 4% or municipal buildings being part of the 4%. The non-supervious surface equates to far greater than 4% of the stormwater management runoff problem. And a prime example of, I mean, we are building in this community multi-million-dollar churches that have more surface area with blacktop and roofing. I just went out and looked at the New Life Community Church, which, as you know, chaps my cheeks like nobody's business. So I'll try to contain myself there. But I'm looking at this building, and I don't know. I don't understand. I think God's work can be done in a smaller facility, but maybe I'm wrong. But it is gargantuan. There has to be 4 holding reservoirs there, retention basins, roof surface that would, I mean, literally you could land a plane on, and the parking lot that you could have a couple more in there. And yet John Casper, in his infinite wisdom, feels as though that churches of that size, because it's only 4% of the general population that we're concerning ourselves with, is a moot point.
Yeah, I wasn't a party to that conversation, but
Well,
I'm
you were
I'm
up
gonna,
doing your job. I was back here, and I could hear him talking.
And I have
so
to
was
tell
just-
you, you know, when I had to chair that meeting, trying to operate all those mics, keep track of how long people are talking makes it very hard for you to think
Yes,
think
and
about the
contribute.
issues. Yeah,
Mhm.
but I think what he's saying is if you go beyond the residential property, so now you're just looking at the business, the commercial property, and the not-for-profits, the schools, churches, the university. I think I'm going to guess that 4% he's talking about is that of those properties, maybe the not-for-profits constitute 4%, and the business community is 96%. I don't know that to be true, but I'm going to guess that that's what he was saying. I do think it's good that the fee not be too heavy this first year, though, because I do think some of the organizations, like our public school system, our university, may not have had enough lead time to budget for the stormwater utility fees. And on something like the university that has this huge campus, or our public school system that has all these schools with enormous roofs and parking lots, their assessments could be very high. So I think it's good that if we can hold that assessment as low as possible, raise after credits about $425,000 to $500,000 from everybody, so that they have a chance to budget, so that they can pay attention to what we're doing in November with our budget and the stormwater utility, to know for the following year.
How to budget more appropriately
That's
for
right.
those expenditures.
Because I really think it would have caught them off guard. And of course, you know, the public school system, that's all us, again, paying that
Right.
bill.
Right.
But no, it's a fair allocation, because churches do have parking lots that a lot of stormwater runs off. And it isn't, you know, it really isn't whether the water goes down into the storm system or it goes into Sawyer Creek. It's really, this is more equitable than the value of property as a way to assess the cost of dealing with
Right.
the ever-increasing amount of surface water. Because the more you go from green fields to paved surfaces, the more stormwater you have to deal with. Now, I grew up in suburban Detroit, near both Ecorse Creek and the Rouge River, which were very small at one time when the environment was natural. But as the suburbs of Detroit grew, the volume of water carried by these creeks and rivers became
Increased.
enormous.
Sure.
And multi-million-dollar projects had to be done to prevent from flooding the areas that these flowed through. Well, that's just a consequence of growth. And that runoff is a function of how much impervious surface there is. So this is just a much fairer way of dealing with it.
Sure.
So when are we going to get a stormwater management utility, Mark?
I think it'll happen in the next council meeting. My reading of the council is the last open item was whether there was going to be some sort of board that would handle the appeals with regard to the credits. And you
Don't
mentioned...
you think that should be done by staff? I mean,
Oh,
I'm all
initially.
I'm all in favor of public input and whatnot, but this is one of those more sophisticated issues that I just don't think the guy or gal off the street is going to be able to do
Sure.
the job with. I really
Well,
don't.
and you mentioned the church with the detention or
Correct.
retention ponds. those may be a plus. And if it's a pond that never goes dry, then the settlement that occurs in those ponds is a plus for water quality. Those ponds are generally designed because the law requires if you develop a green field, the rate at which the water flows off in a 10-year rain can be no greater than it was when it was a green field.
Sure.
So what you do is you slow down the water in those ponds and then release it slower over a long period. And that has a benefit to us because you're affecting the peak flows. You're not reducing the total amount of water. The total amount of water is still increasing, but the rate that it's coming off at the peak flows, which is another flooding problem, is regulated. So those are good things when they put those ponds in. And we're really at the flood water stage of this where we're dealing with flooding problems.
Right.
There is going to be a water quality aspect of this over time. And, hopefully we can build some incentives in the system for people to do things that will deal with the water quality, like allowing the water to flow over a green space before it enters the stormwater system, which might allow some filtration. There's just a lot of little things they can do.
Sure. Mark, I have one final question, and I'm sorry to do this to you right at the end. The time, once again, has just flown by. Tony Palmieri of the show Commentary has suggested that because of your ties to the Oshkosh Chamber, Steve Hentz's, the mayor's ties, and Councilman Frank Towers' ties to the chamber, because of those ties, the three of you should abstain from voting at all on the stormwater utility. He's suggesting that there's a conflict of interest there. He said even the appearance of impropriety should be avoided. How would you respond to that? And I'm sorry to do this right at the end, Mark. The time
Sure.
has flown. There's like 2 minutes
Well,
left, and
in
so,
some ways it's silly because it's apparent that all 7 members of the council are in favor of creating a stormwater utility. And I don't know what he would think would be accomplished because what he's suggesting is that the chamber is opposed to stormwater utility, and they are.
yes,
Yeah.
very much
But all
so.
7 members of the council are in favor of it. He must be suggesting that we're not going to be in favor of it because either we're business people or, in my case, the tie he cites on his webpage is that I was in the Leadership Oshkosh program.
Yes.
And I think they
Yeah.
ran an ad for Leadership Oshkosh, which I was in. But none of those things would disqualify us from dealing with an issue that's really a stormwater issue. And, you can't get too silly about this, having people not vote on things, or else you're going to make it so that the only people that can serve on a city council are people that are retired and that haven't been active in the community in any clubs or groups. And when you get down to it, you would eliminate many of the best people for those positions. If there's a direct conflict where I stand to profit from a decision, personally, that makes sense to make that change. But this would
And
be
on that,
silly.
I have to say thank you. Thank you very much for being here. It's
Thank
been a
you for having
pleasure.
me on the show.
Thanks, Mark.
Enjoyed
And
it.
thank you for joining us as always. Keep your eye on us. We've got our eye on Oshkosh. Take care.